Good evening, everyone. My name is Elvira. I'm Professor of Innovation Studies and Director of the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research here at Alliance Manchester Business School. And I'm delighted to welcome you all, whether in the room or joining online, to this public lecture on behalf of the Institute of Innovation Research and the co-organizers, the Productivity Institute and the Center of the History of Science, Technology and Medicine. Tonight's event cuts across the interests of these three centers, being focused on lessons from the recent history of technology policy in the UK. For today's renewed interest in industrial policies, driven not just by concerns on economic competitiveness, productivity, leveling up of the twin digital and green transitions, but also increasingly about concerns on economic security and technology sovereignty. Tonight, we're going to hear from Tom Kelsey. He's a prize-winning historian of technology. He's also worked in the UK civil servants and is currently an ESRC Policy and Research Fellow at the Blavatnik School of Government at the University of Oxford, where he has been working on a project aimed at improving policymaking at the intersection of economic prosperity and national security, and has just produced working paper that will be the starting point of his talk today. Specifically, Tom is going to talk about the lessons we can learn from the UK's past experience with high-tech mission-oriented industrial and technology policies, and the implications for today's highly charged debates about industrial strategy and geopolitics. Tom will talk for around 30 minutes. And then I will ask my colleague Richard Jones to respond to his talk. Richard is Professor of Materials Physics and Innovation Policy, and also Vice President for Regional Innovation and Civic Engagement at the University of Manchester. Richard is also an influential commentator on UK innovation policy and an associate of the Manchester Institute of Innovation Research and a co-investigator of the Productivity Institute. After Richard's comments and Tom's response to the comments, we will open the discussion to questions from the room and also online, and we aim to wrap up around 6:30. So without further ado, I'm going to leave the floor to Tom. So thank you very much.
Thanks for that introduction. I just want to start by saying a big thanks to the Productivity Institute, the Center for the History of Science, Technology and Medicine, and also the Institute of Innovation Research for inviting me today. Particularly, I want to say thanks, though, I think, to Kieran, Professor Kieran Flanagan, who I think did a lot of the work behind the scenes to get me here today. I just want to briefly say that it has been a privilege to work with the Hayward team at the Blavatnik School of Government this year. And in part of the argument that I want to say tonight is that there's a little bit more good sense within the UK policymaking machinery than we might assume. And I just want to say that my colleagues who I've been working with are a great testament to that fact. Although I want to clarify that my talk tonight represents my views only. So the paper I published last week looks at the lessons Whitehall learned in high technology during the 1970s. And it makes the claim that it became accepted across the British state that Britain should no longer try to be the science and tech superpower. And there was a masked and complex axing of its great long-running investments. And in fact, I also argue that this humbling of the nation's technological ambitions was actually for the best. The techno-nationalist decades of the 1950s and 1960s had not led to export glory and industrial domination, as their designers had planned, but commercial failure and technological dead ends. So I suggest that in the central cases of aviation and nuclear power, the winding down of Britain's state-led innovation economy was actually a good thing. The post-war United States is valorized quite a bit for its mission economy and its entrepreneurial state, demonstrating how governments can pick winners and sponsor next generation technological leaps. What I suggest in the paper is that post-war Britain suggests a different story, demonstrating that actually it's far easier for the technological superpower of the day, as the United States was, to take ambitious bets in the knowledge it might win them, but a lot harder for medium-sized nations to do the same. In this lecture tonight, I want to take a bit more of a contemporary look at the geopolitics of industrial strategy, analysing why it's made such a powerful comeback and reflect on how successful it's been, particularly focusing on Bidenomics, given that this has emerged as the key model for the centre-left in the UK. Or maybe I should say a key model for the centre-left. I then want to think through how successful UK strategy and high technology has been in recent years. And actually, the core argument here is that despite the many and varied critiques, I think the UK is navigating a difficult and complex policy area with more skill than it is often credited for. And actually, this is partly because the UK is not really trying to be a science and tech superpower, at least not compared to the ambitions of the 1950s and the 1960s. I want to suggest that we should continue this streak of realism, and that actually Bidenomics, at least in the ways in which it's commonly understood, is not a ready-made model for the UK. In charting its future, Britain should put incremental progress for the common good, not technological glory, at the centre of its industrial strategy. I think it speaks to the realities of our new politics that it was Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, who recently gave a major speech about the direction of economic policy making in the United States. And in this speech, he describes Bidenomics with noted eloquence, explaining how the United States under President Biden is pursuing a modern industrial and innovation strategy, both at home and with partners around the world. There are high ambitions for this strategy. He made it clear that its purpose was to reindustrialize the United States, tackle the geopolitical risk of China, solve the climate crisis, and strengthen equality as well as democracy, both at home and abroad. Quote, it means providing space for partners around the world to restore the compact between governments and their voters and workers, unquote. So in total, Biden's package of state investment amounts to around $2 trillion. And actually what's striking is that the majority is not on high technology, but infrastructure, which is seeing a 1.2 trillion boost, while semiconductors and AI are receiving 280 billion and climate tech around 400 billion. So just this helps us to understand that the Inflation Reduction Act, which is the climate tech bit of Bidenomics, shouldn't stand in for the whole, which it often does in UK discussions. And I think it's also important to point out that this is not a politics of state-led missions akin to the moonshot, where the state is breaking through fundamentally to new technologies in a very selective way, but it's actually more about creating market incentives for private firms to manufacture tech, particularly in the United States. So through crowding in private investment, Sullivan estimates that the total investment will be 3.5 trillion in the next decade. And in fact, in a later article for Foreign Affairs, Sullivan really clarified the centrality of working with the private sector to Bidenomics. Quote, these public investments are not about picking winners and losers or bringing globalization to an end. They enable rather than replace private investment. So what should analysts of science and tech policy make of all this, and how effective has Bidenomics been? Adam Tooze pointed out in his chart book that the importance of the Industrial Reflation Act in particular is rather exaggerated. So in relation to GDP, it's about half the level of subsidy that the European Union has devoted to climate tech. But actually, I think the most important criticism of Bidenomics is that it's not a plan for dealing with the climate crisis directly with the politics of alliances and international cooperation that would require, but one really largely about securing American jobs. I would say that The Economist produced a really must-read report on the rise and re-emergence of industrial strategy a couple of months ago. And there was an important observation that actually the rise of subsidies for manufacturing, rather than installing green tech, could slow the green transition at a global level. Because what's happening is that foreign tech is being blocked from the United States market, so we're losing economies of scale. Or at least that's the short-term scenario. Whether friendshoring is really helping democratic nations is also up for debate. Since 2019, exports from autocracies to the rich world, excluding China, have risen by 30%, while those from democracies have only risen by 25%. And the final point to make, and for some it'll be the most significant, is that Bidenomics doesn't seem to be working electorally. In a recent poll, almost 70% of American voters felt that Biden's economic program had not made them better off, or it had no impact. And the chief problem here is that many Americans see Bidenomics as an important cause of inflation, and not entirely wrong in doing so. Now, you could say that all of these criticisms are actually unfair. In the very, very particular context in which the United States finds itself, you could say with reason that it's naive to think that they would adopt a liberal internationalist approach to the climate crisis with cooperative action at its heart. And actually, there is no doubt a deep awareness within the US policymaking machinery of the need to bring allies along with them, both in fighting the climate crisis and both in dealing with the ascent of China. And, you know, this is a long-term transformation in our politics. And so I think it is too early to truly assess the geopolitical impact of what the United States is trying to do. But I do still think that these criticisms are helpful. And what they're helpful with is dislodging the sense that the US provides a nice, easy roadmap for the United Kingdom. It's not entirely unfair to suggest that Bidenomics, at least for now, appears to be a modest, largely nationalistic and electorally unpopular response to global problems that it might not solve. And in fact, in any case, the wider point is that the UK needs to understand that it's peculiar in and of itself to assume that an industrial strategy for the largest economy in the world, and one still with a lot of technological power, would naturally work in a medium-sized country with far lower rates of productivity and whose economic strengths rest in the service sector. So before thinking what the UK should do with regards to its industrial strategy, I think we need to look for a moment at how recent governments have approached high technology. An increasingly important part of the criticisms leveled at the Conservative governments is in fact about industrial strategy. And I think there's sort of three key arguments here. The first is to say that there is no strategy, that while the rest of the world has embraced a new politics of industrial intervention, Britain has not. And so Britain is missing out on the jobs of the future. This is especially central to the Labour critique. Others suggest that there's inconsistency, that there's been too much chopping and changing, and this has damaged whatever serious thinking has developed in this space. So many people derided Boris Johnson for getting rid of Theresa May's industrial strategy 2 years into his premiership, for instance. And the final critique is to attack the perceived nationalistic delusion underpinning one area where there has been clear commitment over the past decade, and that's the idea that the UK should be a science and tech superpower. So one prominent commentator recently asked, what realistically can a country with 2% of world R&D and manufacturing output, which is not world leading in the level of productivity, hope to control? Now, I think all of these arguments apply when it comes to thinking about industrial strategy at a general level, but I'm not entirely convinced they're 100% fair when thinking about high technology in particular. And I think in the world of high technology, there has been a little bit more strategy, consistency and realism than maybe these criticisms would allow us to see. So when I say high technology in this context, I want to be clear that I'm referring to those technologies that are considered to be essential to the future. So AI, quantum, semiconductors, and advanced weapons as well. And to understand the strategy in this area, I think the integrated review is the place to turn. And actually, the integrated review is fairly clear-sighted. It suggests that the UK should build on its national strengths with full awareness of the need to rigorously assess where Britain should pioneer its breakthroughs, work with partners, buy from abroad. And broadly speaking, this is what the government has been doing. So take the semiconductor strategy published earlier this year. It came under quite a bit of public criticism for its lack of ambition, but I think it's fairly shrewd about Britain's place in this global industry. In the end, it gave small amounts of funding to areas of UK advantage within design, IP, and R&D, but it was clear that really, in terms of supply, Britain would rely on its allies. There was concern when BAE Systems announced they were working on a sixth-generation fighter jet that it might exclusively be a national effort, but were designing this aeroplane alongside Italy and Japan. Of course, there's been an uptick for state funding for AI in the UK, but the flagship policy of the Prime Minister was, of course, the AI Safety Summit, where there was a deep understanding that Britain needs to work with allies and international business to secure responsible use of AI. And Rishi Sunak made this extraordinarily clear in his speeches. So, of course, there is deeply misleading rhetoric about Britain leading the way in the fourth industrial revolution like it did in the first. But when you drill down to the level of policy, I think Britain's understanding of its place in its technological place in the world is actually rather better than it was certainly in the 1950s and the 1960s. There is a deep understanding that we need to work with other countries and with private business as well. So while the UK is working to ensure it keeps its areas of competitive advantage, there's no serious attempt to leapfrog the US, the EU, and China to technological glory on the par to, say, a Concorde. Given where we are in the electoral cycle and what the polls suggest, I think the final questions I want to deal with are, should Labour change direction in industrial strategy, and if so, in what ways? And actually, I think the history of industrial strategy in post-war Britain is really useful to turn to before thinking about these questions, because it helps us get a grip on some of the issues at hand. And I think the first point to make is that we can't assume that all state intervention in the economy is socially democratic, and especially not in the British case. There are historians of post-war Britain who define social democracy as essentially any effort in industrial intervention, to the extent that even armaments have become social democratic projects. And the particular claim in that argument is that the warfare state had a central place in driving British industry. It was securing jobs, it was gaining exports. Now, of course, I think it's correct to point to the highly militarized nature of Britain's developmental state, but I think it is important to appreciate that many insiders at the time didn't believe in the employment case for the warfare state. So throughout the Cold War, the Treasury in particular, but it wasn't alone, repeatedly called for Britain to build more weapons under license or to buy weapons from abroad, bemoaning the opportunity costs of Britain's military-industrial complex, which it is important to remember was far larger than any other in Western Europe. Buying British or European in armaments when cheaper and better quality foreign alternatives are available doesn't guarantee either national security or economic prosperity. The Challenger 2 tank that the UK sent to the UK, for example, was not the tank that the British Army wanted. The British Army, when the procurement decision was being made, actually wanted the American Abrams, for example. They later changed their mind slightly and argued for the Leopard, but the point is that it would have helped the people of the Ukraine to give them more of the same tank rather than developing a British to develop a British tank within NATO. So I think the point is that the idea that the warfare state was about jobs and exports sort of takes the public defense at face value. If we see social democracy as a commitment to equality, and some historians do this, I think it becomes clearer that it was ultimately the opponents of techno-nationalism who were social democratic, not its defenders. That it was the critics of these great schemes who were concerned with the use of state resources to deliver a more equal society. So, for instance, Richard Wiggs, who led the organized opposition to Concorde, the Anglo-French supersonic jet, complained about so many resources being spent on an aeroplane for the elite, demonstrating that he was not anti-aviation, never mind anti-science. He rightly argued that if the desire was to reduce flight times for as many people as possible, then it would make sense to improve train links between city centres and airports. The motivating ideology of high technology projects like Concorde and British designed nuclear reactors was not to make a more equal Britain, but a belief that being in the technological cutting edge would bring both geopolitical power and industrial might, which I think in these cases turned out to be misguided. Now, that strategy of pursuing the technological frontier might be a reasonable one if you are the technological superpower, but it is far harder for a declining nation to try to leapfrog much stronger nations from a position of relative weakness. Throughout the post-war decades, Britain invested in a series of overambitious gambles. Concorde was only sold to the countries who made it. No country ever bought Britain's second-generation nuclear reactors. So a generation, really, of scientists and engineers were wasted on state-led technological dead ends. And I think the lesson to take from all this is not that we should abandon industrial strategy, but that we should be particularly wary of claims to technological superiority in particular. In a way, it makes perfect sense that if you look at the more concrete areas of, say, agriculture and roads, the British state was more successful in investing for the long term. So let's come back to the present and come back to the Labour's plans for industrial strategy. I don't think it's unfair to say that within the Labour Party, the central idea is really to green the economy and put a Union Jack on it. In 2021, when Labour's £28 billion Green Prosperity Fund was announced, this was meant to be, I think, and still is, the clear difference between them and the Conservatives. The policy document, Make Britain a Clean Energy Superpower, is, as many critics have pointed out, short on details, but there is certainly a clarity of direction. The plans are modelled on Bidenomics and about boosting UK manufacturing, cutting regional inequalities, ensuring cheaper energy bills, and decarbonising all at the same time. And the specific idea is that GB Energy, which would be a new publicly owned climate tech company, would be established to develop new tech, from tidal to clean hydrogen, in the hope of eventually breaking into the export markets. There's so much about these ideas that is obviously laudable, but I think there's still huge questions about how this money will be spent exactly. And of course, there will be times when buying British and decarbonising as quickly as possible go hand in hand, but this isn't always going to be the case. And actually, a quick look at how the UK is doing with the installation of heat pumps underlines the point about the scale of the challenge of trying to get to net zero. Would a Labour government continue with the consumer subsidies for replacing gas boilers, or would it give state support to grow the domestic industry? We don't really know the answers yet. And also, the claim that supporting green tech would lead to a jobs boom, I think, is also worthy of challenge, given the capital-intensive and highly skilled nature of such work. Danny Roddick, who is one of the most important and influential advocates for industrial strategy at the moment, is putting a huge amount of stress on the need to support the service sector in industrial strategy to broaden what is the typical focus of such policy. And I think it's right that if Labour does want to level up Britain, tackle regional inequality and secure good jobs, then it can't just focus on manufacturing. Thankfully, we have the ideas at hand to help us think through alternative plans. The notion of the foundational economy, which I think was born at the University of Manchester, is a new conceptual framework for thinking about industrial strategy, which says that we should stop dreaming of technological glory and instead start trying to make people's lives better by focusing on the foundational infrastructures that people depend upon. And I think this approach really speaks in profound ways to the realities of our economy. We move away from the peculiar focus on manufacturing to the service sector, where 80% of people work, wherein poor pay and poor productivity become the key issues. The solutions involve improving the quality of public services, funding social care properly, and improving state provision for childcare. And I think one of the important points to make about these sorts of arguments is that they're likely to be better for the economy, especially in terms of job creation, than expensive bets on export successes. So research from the Women's Budget Group suggests investing in the care sector generates more jobs than, say, in construction, where much infrastructural spending goes even when wages are matched. Studies suggest that 90% of the cost of universal childcare, even if it was high quality, could be regained through taxing earnings and reduced social security spending. It's important to appreciate that the Labour figures, and indeed powerful ones, clearly understand the importance of these arguments. So Rachel Reeves, the Shadow Chancellor, has actually cited the foundational literature from the foundational economy group in her policy documents and spoken too about the importance of the everyday economy. Reeves hit the headlines for her Securonomics speech earlier in the year. And if you read the policy document she published alongside this, you will find commitments to investing in public services, making childcare affordable, and recruiting thousands of mental health professionals to end the crisis in provision. One of the 4 missions of Labour's industrial strategy is centred around care, a pledge to ensure a high-quality care sector across the nation. But I think the point to make is that in the areas where Labour clearly is thinking about the foundational economy, the spending commitments are not as clear, certainly not as detailed as they are with the Green Prosperity Plan. And actually, one of the ironies of all this is that if you actually look at what Biden was originally trying to achieve, it was actually really quite centered on the foundational economy. The measures that got through, the investments in infrastructure, chips, and climate tech, were actually watered down from a wider package of spending, which included lots of ambitious social policies, including 400 billion earmarked for childcare and for preschools. So the criticism, I think, is that Labour is not only just planning to ape a plan from a technological superpower, but has put the focus on some of its most nationalistic elements. Okay, to conclude. I think there needs to be more discussion of the realities of technological power within our debates in industrial strategy. Much of the literature is caught up in talking about whether state intervention works in an abstract sense. And this, I think, misses a fundamental point that what might work in one country could fail in another. Whitehall learned during the 1970s that it was remarkably hard to take on the technological superpower of the day and win, coming to understand that a commitment to the long term, lavish funding, and giving engineers a lot of freedom doesn't always yield success. In the cases of aviation and nuclear power, I would argue Whitehall was in fact right to undermine the mission economy and entrepreneurial state that it itself had created in the 1950s and the 1960s. While the institutional memory of projects like Concorde has now failed from view, there is, I would suggest, no serious return to the techno-nationalism of the 1950s and the 1960s in the UK today. And when you look at high technology policy opposed to the rhetoric, it's clear that the policy-making system understands that we need to work with our allies and with private business too to build the technological future. Given the lack of details, it's not entirely clear whether Labour does want us to return to the age of radical techno-nationalism. but as I'm sure you can guess, I hope they don't. I don't think it's good to buy into the dichotomy that there's national security on the one hand and free markets on the other. Liberal democracies get much of their security through their alliances and through their openness. After austerity, COVID-19, and the cost of living crisis, I think there should be a greater focus on humble aims, not on technological dominance, with an industrial strategy that has the foundational economy at its core. While incremental progress for the common good may not sound as exciting as the white heat of Harold Wilson's scientific revolution, I think it's more likely to improve people's lives. Thanks again for inviting me to speak, and I look forward to Richard's comments.